Broadcasting the information the mainstream media won't touch. This is The Richie Allen Show in association with DavidIke.com.
Well, I'm looking forward to chatting with our first guest this evening. He's an American political scientist. He's very well known for his work on international security affairs, especially the strategies of air power and the rationale of suicide terrorism. He is currently a professor of political science at the University of Chicago, as I did mention a bit earlier on, and he founded the Chicago Project on Security and Terrorism. Another very interesting fact about him is that during the 2008 presidential campaign, he served as an advisor not only to the eventual winner, the junior senator from Illinois, Barack Obama, but also the Republican Ron Paul, whom we've heard so much about on this programme over the last few years. I'm delighted to welcome to the programme Robert Pape. Bob, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me on.
Well, thanks for doing it. It's lovely to have you on. I am going to tweet out your details, your Facebook and Twitter page, and links to where people can find your recent books, Cutting the Fuse, Dying to Win, and Bombing to Win, which are fascinating books indeed. Bob, how does the theory that there's not much of a connection between Islamic fundamentalism to suicide bombings, how does that theory relate to what we saw in Brussels yesterday?
Well, religion is not a very good predictor of the timing of spectacular attacks like we saw in Brussels, and why they happen in certain countries at certain times and not other countries and not other times. And it is the case that many suicide attackers are religious, and there's no doubt in my mind that the Brussels attackers we're going to discover were religious, although I think we're also going to discover they're varied quite a bit in that, because we have learned more about the variation with respect to how religious, even so-called religious suicide attackers are. But the bottom line is that there is a much better way to understand the threat in a much more practical way, which is to realize that a group like ISIS and its supporters are driven by a strategic logic that is focused on territory. What the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria wants, more than anything else, is territory. They want to control territory in Iraq and Syria, and they want to defend territory in Iraq and Syria. And that simple idea has been an idea I've been discussing now for quite a long time in my work, and it is extremely helpful in understanding the threat that we face, why it emerges when it does, and what to do to make it better and what not to do to make it worse. And that idea, again, is that the groups want territory. So let me, if you don't mind.
No, but just before you do, you've gone further than that, which is something I like. You've gone as far as to say, and maybe you haven't been popular for saying it, that and I would like you to give our listeners a little flavour of the history of suicide bombings, because you've researched it in great depth from 1980 up until, well, pretty much now. But before that, you've gone far enough, or as far to say that what they want to do is basically to force back occupiers, other countries who are occupying their countries, occupying their territory, and that's not made you too popular sometimes.
That's what I mean. Yeah. So thank you very much. So a way to put it in more policy terms is that suicide terrorism is a response to military occupation and control of territory that the terrorists prize. And what the reason I focus on the territory is because what the terrorists are doing is rejecting others controlling and influencing the politics, the economics, and the social structures on territory that they prize. So that means that although we might not understand our military presence in overseas countries in the Middle East as a, quote, occupying force, we wouldn't define ourselves that way.
Some of us would.
Many in the Middle East see this all. This is the median voter's view in the Middle East.
Fair enough.
This is how they see America and European military presence and influence. They don't see this in a positive light. They see the average person on the street sees Western and American military influence as exerting control in a tight way that they cannot change over their political institutions, their economic institutions, and their social institutions. Now, many Americans might think that this is not a good description, but let me just point out that when we say we want to empower women in traditional societies, what we're doing is we're changing the role of women in other societies. And if we also then have military force involved, this is changing the way of life of another people at the point of a barrel of a gun. We may not quite see it that way ourselves, but we shouldn't be surprised that others see it this way, and they reject it. They reject not just the social change, but the coerced social change. And that's why military intervention, military occupation of territory that the terrorists and their local communities prize is the number one driver of suicide attacks.
Now, Bob, in your book, Bombing to Win, you hinted, well, you didn't hint, you more or less said, is that what we're calling terrorists now, in many cases, were people, farmers, men, women, ordinary folks like us, whom were bombed in the belief that by bombing them, they would rise up against the totalitarian government that we didn't like. But as you wrote extensively about in Bombing to Win, it didn't have that effect. It actually drew those people together, supported their own government, and was definitely a feeding ground for terrorists. Or a breeding ground, I should say. Excuse me, breeding ground.
That's right. That's right, Richie. And thank you for looking so carefully into my work. I can't tell you how much I appreciate being on a show where the host is really so knowledgeable.
Thanks for that. Appreciate that. But yeah, you did say that. You went as far as to say that. I would, and I want you to think about that for a second. While we also think about, in recent times, people like former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, presidential candidate, and others, even John Kerry several years ago, said that we are basically reaping what we have sown now in the third world and in Central America. We have gone in there before. We have violently overthrown governments there. We have armed people, called them our friends. We didn't care whether they were lunatics or not, Bob. And we're reaping what we sown. And we know Clinton said that. So put that alongside what you wrote so well about in Bombing to Win, which is we bomb people to try and bomb democracy into them. They'll turn against their governments, but they don't. And we're basically responsible for what we see happening today.
I'm afraid that that's right. So after 9/11, we were, as a people, shocked by a terrorist group attacking us. And bin Laden was the leader of al-Qaeda. And we toppled the Taliban in Afghanistan, where bin Laden was holed up. But what we did, rather than finish the job against bin Laden, is we diverted ourselves into the conquest of Iraq. The conquest of Iraq in 2003 produced a massive suicide terrorist campaign. It produced the suicide terrorist group Al-Qaeda in Iraq, did not exist before. And basically created more terrorists than we ever killed. It unleashed, by destabilizing Iraq, it produced a civil war that killed 100,000 Iraqis, where they mostly killed each other in this Hobbesian state of nature that was unleashed, which then had destabilizing effects in Syria.
Yeah, with weapons we gave them, by the way.
Yeah, which then basically created ungoverned space for millions and millions of people. And the idea of building a shining, well-working democracy was very, noble, but also not very practical. This is a tremendous social, economic, and political change in a country like Iraq and certainly Syria, and is a project of many generations, not a year or two. And the chaos that is unleashed in such projects was certainly likely to happen. This is not just a surprise.
This is important, Bob. Can I just interrupt you there? I hate interrupting, but this is brilliant. This is brilliant because I'm going to sound, in a few minutes' time, I'm going to sound to you like a raging conspiracy theorist. So I'm going to give you advance warning now. Okay. You're going to say this Irish guy's a conspiracy theorist, but I want you to keep that in mind. This idea is that, that they must expect the consequences of these actions. They can't say, well, we're surprised at how it turned out. Before we do that, though, it's going crazy on Twitter, this. It's at Richie Allen Show on Twitter. We're having dozens of tweets. Listeners are saying, interested in what Bob is having to say, but with the religious link again. Why would these guys not plant bombs? Why would they strap bombs to themselves and kill themselves unless, Bob, they believed in the paradise, the ever after paradise? That's a good question. Why would they not plant bombs?
So many, there are hundreds and hundreds of secular suicide attackers. The Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka for 25 years were the leading suicide terrorist group in the world. Until Iraq, we invaded and conquered Iraq and produced an even bigger suicide terrorist group. The leaders in suicide terrorism from 1980 to 2004 were the Tamil Tigers, a secular group, a Marxist group, a Hindu group. The Tamil Tigers were focused on this world, not on the next world. The PKK in Turkey is a Muslim, secular suicide terrorist group. In ISIS today, 1/3 of the leaders of ISIS are former military commanders for Saddam Hussein. That is, they're Ba'ath Party leaders who are secular. We have lots and lots of secular people doing suicide attacks.
Now, Bob, tell me this.
What doing it?
Sorry, go ahead. Finish that point, and then I'll come back. Go on. Go ahead.
The reason they're doing it is because they want to produce a political change to get rid of foreigners influencing and neglect or out of a malign intention. But we do agree on the impact, which is that it is the case that we are not putting in resources for people to be involved in monitoring known threats, or people that should be much higher up on the threat list. And you are putting your finger on that, because what we have found in more than one case, in troubling number of cases, is that not having enough people in the security services for surveillance, and relying too much on technology and so-called efficient solutions is underserving us. I don't think it's really a malign, malicious cause, because I think that we really are not dealing with people in authority who want to see their own people killed. I just don't think that's true. I think that we are dealing with a situation where there is a general limit on resources that are being provided because of the hope that these are one-offs, not a sustained problem. And I think that the other thing to say is that we have a political problem here of not overreacting. So I think that although I wish the Obama administration would do more discussion of the clarity of the threat. So Obama himself often discusses the political grievances that are driving terrorism, but not always on the days after a terrorist attack. I wish he would link them more directly to the attacks. However, I do think that some of our political leaders are actually trying to prevent overreaction. They're trying to not overreact to terrorism, and it's because that can get out of hand. And so I think there is a bit of a dilemma here in domestically. If we overreact, we could actually easily make matters worse.
Can I offer a counterpoint to that?
Sure.
You did say that, and a lot of people share your opinion, that the security services, and I don't mean MI5 and MI6, or maybe I do, and the police forces, the specialist terrorist police in different countries are undermanned. And you might be right, Bob, and in fact I think you probably are right. But again, there's a big problem with that, because you said that maybe the politicians don't want to overreact. However, in Britain, particularly in Britain anyway, and in Europe, since the shootings in Tunisia last year, since the foiled shootings on the train, since Paris, Bob, they have been warning us that attacks are imminent, non-stop. This is what we get. We had the Interpol chief coming out a couple of weeks ago, said there are 5,000 Islamic State operatives in Europe. He didn't offer any proof, but he said that, and he said that an attack is imminent. So that, if indeed they are undermanned, and you might be right, well then there's something very, very sinister going on, Bob, because they're telling us that ISIS moved their strategy last year into large-scale European attacks. So for them now to say we don't have the manpower to chase people, something wrong there, Bob.
Well, yes, but so Richie, what I would just to roll back in time. So back in November after Paris, I was one of the very first people. So I published a piece in the Boston Globe just 2 days after Paris, explaining the cause of Paris as ISIS is being crushed in Iraq and Syria. They're not getting stronger. They're actually being crushed by military intervention from the United States, France, Russia, Turkey, other countries, and they have been lashing out against those countries. And that's what caused Paris. It connects the dots and lays out the facts, and then said we should then expect more such attacks in the coming months, because this military campaign against ISIS is actually going to continue, and ISIS is going to keep losing territory. That is where the military intervention is going to work. Well, what happened is politically, politicians started to say that ISIS was getting stronger, which wasn't true. They began to argue about whether future attacks would occur or not. And so I think that it really is difficult to get the political class to really think about the strategic logic of terrorism. There's lots of reasons why they easily get diverted from it. And I think that what you're saying is you're taking the strategic logic as a deep given by the political class. I think if it was a deep given, we'd actually be in better shape. I find myself debating the political class on this all the time. So what you see as a deep given and then drawing conclusions from, I see that over the last 10 years, we've made progress in persuading the political class about the strategic logic. Ron Paul, others come out and actually will say it. Others, I think, accept it a little more subtly. But this is, I think, still the battle. And so I don't really think that it's actually the conspiracy part that's the problem. I think it's still, do they really get it's the strategic logic? Because if they did, then you wouldn't see politicians calling for doubling down on pounding the Muslim community in the United States and Western Europe, or doubling down and wanting to pour more ground forces back into Iraq and then into Syria.
Yeah, I'll tell you what, Bob. It's my fault that you misunderstand me, by the way. I don't want to appear as if I think it's a given that they would do the right thing. What I'm suggesting is very sinister, that they know full well that these attacks are imminent, that they're likely, and for another agenda. And we can speculate about that. We won't get into that tonight, but I get into it with other people on the programme, people like John Perkins, Ray McGovern, by the way, former CIA, who's been on the programme, Paul Craig Roberts, former, he worked at the Treasury, didn't he, with Ronald Reagan. Paul has gone as far as to say that some of these attacks are false flag attacks, but I'm not going to get into that with you. But I do want to say this. Can I just say this before you come back in? At what point, and I'm delighted you're on the programme, by the way, it's lovely to have you on, because it's a different point of view to what we get on the programme sometimes. At what point, Bob, should we say this? Stop. We can have no further discussions about the Syrian situation or ISIS or whatever until we first of all address how they rose to prominence and prosecute those who are responsible for that.
I do think that calling for great attention on how Western military intervention is the number one cause of suicide terrorism is the key. And now I think that we just had a little debate, and I made my case, you made your case. But whoever was right about the intentionality here, the public can bring tremendous pressure to bear on elites, but it's the public that we need to speak to. They're the solution, and I think that the way to go forward is to use opportunities when there are the tragedies to talk about the causes of the tragedies, and to point the finger at the military intervention, which is driving the tragedy.
I agree with you, by the way.
And that, I think, is really the key thing, because under those, when I confront the political class, and I say, do you mean to tell me that you would publicly defend an action that would kill more Americans than it would save? You would do it? None of them will do it. None of them will do it.
Do you know the problem you have, Bob? Do you know the problem you have? And I respect your opinion. And listen, I tell you this, I have never said in all the years I've presented radio, and I've presented commercial radio, national radio, and independent radio, I have never said I'm right. because I don't believe that I know everything. I have a lot of sympathy with, or empathy with a lot of what you've had to say. The problem that you have is, and I noticed in researching what you've been doing today, and I've watched interviews you've done for ABC and other channels. You're a smart guy. You're a principled guy who believes what he says. The media in the United States, Bob, they don't want to hear what you're saying. They don't want to hear, well, we might very well be the reason for the global unrest, and especially the unrest in the Middle East and what's happening there. They want to marginalise voices like yours.
There may be a lot of truth to that. It may not sell as many newspapers to hear this position. It may not bring in advertisers to hear this position. But what I think is that it may, be surprising, but we are bit by bit getting our voices heard. And so I just say, if you look at the Atlantic today online, there's a major piece about my position. If you look at the Boston Globe, for 2 days now, they've really been pushing my analysis of what happened in Brussels, and I think this is progress, and so I think it is a challenge. Because I do think that you're right. It runs against a certain grain, but I do think that we have a lot of intelligent people in the public who are actually quite hungry for a real way out of this mess. And I think that it's shows like yours that are very positive that can help. And I think that I take a very optimistic stand. I look over the last 10 years, and I'm just surprised at how much this message has been able to go forward. And it's, I think it's actually gaining ground, not just it is difficult, but I don't think it's, I think it's progressing.
I think it is. I want to thank you for coming on. Folks, read Bombing to Win, Dying to Win and Cutting the Fuse by Robert Pape, and check Bob out at the University of Chicago and the Chicago Project on Security and Terrorism. Interestingly enough, Bob, before we go, I did have Stephen Kinzer on the programme a few weeks back, who'd be a colleague of yours at the Boston Globe, and fascinating conversation with Stephen, and we had the same, I won't say disagreements, we had the same differences of opinion with Stephen as I did with you. He's very much on your side of that in terms of what is deliberate and what isn't. I really appreciate your time. It's a valued contribution to us here. Thanks for doing it, and stay in touch.
And thank you for all you're doing. I'm really, really delighted to be on, and really, thank you very much for having me.
It was an honour, Bob. Thank you very much. Professor Robert Pape on the line to us there from the University of Chicago, Illinois.